This was never going to cause mass casualties. The international community and Israel's own defense systems were going to very quickly be utilised. And this, we've heard there's a child who's been injured here, but and that's terrible. But 99% of these drones appear to have been intercepted. So the question very much is what happens now, both domestically and in terms of international views on this with the UN Security Council and G7.
If one of these missiles or drones had not been intercepted and hit something or someone or caused a mass casualty event, we would be talking about a very different scenario this morning. And you can't rule things like that out. So there's always that risk and element of danger. I think you're right. And I think a lot of the analysis and what we heard just earlier is absolutely spot on. This was performative. It is about Iran gesturing to its own internal domestic politics here. But on that front, I also think that's been a bit of a strategic mistake, because for some time now, we have seen Benjamin Netanyahu very much under pressure from Western allies, including the United States, its lead supporter. And this attack by Iran, I think, has actually shown overnight all those allies who had been criticising Netanyahu. The Australian government's a really good example. It's been saying in all its messaging, the Netanyahu government must do this, the Netanyahu government must do that. We disagree with the Netanyahu government on X, Y, and Z. And so you are now seeing, I think, a bit of a reversal or a scaling back of that, because this will generate enormous sympathy for Israel. We know that Iran's stated goal is to wipe Israel from the map. You see a massive attack launched at it, and you see the allies coming to help, particularly France, Britain, and the United States. So overall, where we land, I think, is in a better, slightly better position for Netanyahu himself politically.
That's interesting as well. Peter, so there's that point from Latika, Netanyahu's political position. Domestically, perhaps. Also globally, is this about whether he can be restrained at this point in some way?
Well, it would suit him, certainly, to have some sort of retaliatory strike against Iran. I wouldn't be surprised if that happens necessarily, but he's holding a very fragile coalition at the moment. We have Benny Gantz, who's probably the favourite, I would imagine, to be the next Israeli Prime Minister. It'll be really interesting to see what he has to say on this. I note that Victoria Atkins, the Health Secretary, has confirmed to Sky News in the last few minutes that our fighter jets, British fighter jets, have been involved with this. So the international coalition is fascinating, especially the points Chloe was making a bit earlier on with Michael Binion in regard to Jordan and Saudi Arabia as well. So there is a lot of support for Israel with this. Certainly we've seen that waning since the 7th of October, given the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, the number of innocent civilians who have been killed there. And Netanyahu has been in a very difficult position. Lots of calls from his own people for an election as soon as possible, even in a state of war, which is basically unprecedented. So it's a very difficult position for him, but certainly this will bolster him. I really thought your point was a brilliant one, Callum, actually, in the performative aspect of this, actually, in terms of the fact that this was never going to cause mass casualties. The international community and Israel's own defense systems were going to very quickly be utilised. And this, we've heard there's a child who's been injured here, but and that's terrible. But 99% of these drones appear to have been intercepted. So the question very much is what happens now, both domestically and in terms of international views on this with the UN Security Council and G7.
And on that then, Latika, so the G7, the UN Security Council, which by the way is meeting at Israel's request, and there's another part of this, I think, which is because it's Israel's request, surely there will be no retaliation before that meeting takes place. That would be slightly unconventional, I suppose. It doesn't make it impossible. But with that in mind, there is diplomacy, Latika, which needs quick results in all of this to deter that idea of escalation, perhaps to try to draw something around the conflict more broadly in as well. So I'm thinking particularly of Gaza, where, one bit of analysis is this distracts from Gaza. So let's think about Gaza. Is it for these diplomatic efforts now to say, hang on a second, we need to protect civilians in Gaza as much as we have just been celebrating the protection of Israelis against this attack from Iran? Is there something of a parallel to be drawn there in the diplomatic efforts from here on out?
I think it's really important to examine the role of the United States here. So we're seeing some reporting coming out from Axios just a few hours ago saying the US has told Israel it won't support any further strikes against Iran. And don't forget, it was a strike that Israel conducted in Syria that started this. So as your guest before explained, this has been tit for tat, and you would say that they are square now. I think any distraction from Gaza for Netanyahu is something he would absolutely want to prolong for as long as he can. But don't forget, this has a lot of implications for the US election. Donald Trump and the Republicans have been trying to argue for some time now that the world was not in the chaos that we see it today when he was president, that under Joe Biden, all these regimes are acting because they see the United States as weak. This will very much play into that. And we saw this from, I think, Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo yesterday saying so much for don't. And that's, of course, a reference to Joe Biden saying to Iran, don't, whatever you do, don't get involved in this regional escalation. Don't start or provoke anything larger or expand the conflict. And so this is, I think, going to play into the US presidential election in a way that we might not normally expect big foreign policy questions to. But this very much is going to cause internal pressure in the United States. So as far as diplomatic efforts go, of course, they will be wanting everybody to exercise restraint. That has been message number one to the region since October the 7th. And whether or not that happens now, I think that's really the question everyone will be asking, looking and watching and waiting for. And it will also be a question of whether the United States does still hold enough leverage over Netanyahu himself and can restrain him.
Just to add a sort of broader consideration, which I think might actually form part of the conversation in the coming days. This comes from Jerome Starkey, who is the brilliant defence editor for The Sun. He says Britain and the US have clearly shown how allies could intercept Russian missiles and Iranian drones fired at Ukraine without necessarily leaving NATO airspace. The US and Britain did not declare war on Iran last night. They protected Israel. Why not the same for Ukraine?